Hi there, my name is Brenda Keenan from KeenanCreations.com, and I'm going to show you a fun technique to watercolor embossed roses. This is a card that uses the Manhattan Flower embossing folder to emboss some watercolor paper. It's layered on basic black and then certainly celery. And you're going to use the aqua painter and the ink from your classic ink pads to watercolor inside the embossed edges. Your watercolor paper is cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. You're going to slip it inside the embossing folder and run it through your Big Shot on tab 1. You're going to use an aqua painter. I like to use the one with the smaller tip. You get 2 in the pack. One has a larger tip and one is smaller. I prefer the smaller of the two. So you're going to unscrew the cap, fill it with water. There's a little fill line marked on the outside, so make sure you don't go past the fill line. I like to have a folded paper towel nearby to blot in case too much water is flowing through. You're going to give it a little squeeze, and you can see right here it's going to fill up with water, and you'll know that you're good to go. And you don't want to have it so wet that it's dripping out, so that's why you want to blot it on the paper towel if it's too much water flowing. So I'm going to work on the smaller of the 2 roses, and I'm going to put just a wash of water across some of the petals just to get it ready to take the ink from the classic ink pads. And it's kind of a sloppy technique, so you don't have to be too exact here. I'll show you some tips to clean up your edges too if you go outside the lines. So I've just got a wash of water on the watercolor paper. I'm going to try Marina Mist for a pretty blue rose. Now you'll notice I haven't squeezed any ink onto the top of the pad. The way you do that, you should close the pad and you just squeeze right in the middle. And then you open it up and you have ink on the lid. So we're going to use that as our palette. And when you first go in here, you go right to the center, but you don't want to make it too dark. So I kind of squiggle it outside the edge here. So I'd rather have too little than too much. And I'm just going to go up to the raised edge here and add some color. So I like to have most of the color applied to the raised edge first, and then I'm going to go to the next one just so I can get some of this color off the brush, and then I'm going to start wiggling it down. So I still have some pretty good amount of color on here, so I'm just going to keep going. So once I feel like most of that color is off, I'm going to start wiggling it. So I'm kind of blurring the edges of that first layer of color that I put on. And I'm just wiggling the paintbrush. And then as I get further down to the bottom of that petal, or that part of the petal, it gets lighter. Okay, so that's a couple of the petals done. So again, you go back to the ink on the pad and wiggle it out so you don't have too much ink on there. And go right up to the raised edge. And then I go back to some of these other ones to get them a little bit darker. And also to remove some of this ink, because I want to kind of wiggle it. And then I go back to this one and I just wiggle. So I'm kind of blurring that first line of color that I put on there. And I don't want this to be too light at the top, so I'm going to go back and add just a little more color. And again, I'm pushing right up to that raised edge. If you get ink on the raised edge, that's okay. We're going to take care of that later, so don't worry. Just go out to the next petal here and wiggle. And then go back and wiggle again. Now a couple things to know with watercoloring. If I were to do this rose that's right next to my blue one, and the blue ink isn't dry yet, they're going to bleed. So you want to make sure this blue rose is completely dry before you go to the next one. So I just keep going back to my ink pad to pick up some color. And if you have too much ink, just go back to a petal you've already done to get rid of some of that ink. and just darken those edges and then start wiggling. And just wiggle all the way down and then go back and wiggle. You don't want to, and you can also brush off any excess ink. So if you feel like you've got too much ink on the brush, just brush it off. Okay, so now we'll come back to here. And if you feel like your paintbrush is getting a little dry, you can give it a squeeze to help that water start flowing again. So again, all you're doing is just going right up against the edge here, and then you wiggle. You're just trying to get a little bit of shading in there with the petals. And then come back, and you just repeat these steps. Give it a little squeeze if you feel like it's not getting enough water, and then just keep wiggling. And I'm just going in between the lines here, and you can go back and pick up a little more color. You just want to have some nice contrast here, different shadings. Now you can also blend some of your colors, like if you have a light pink and a yellow and you want to mix those two, you're going to get some orange, yellow, and pink in your petals. I'm just keeping this simple with one color. So you can see I'm just putting color along the edges here and go back to any areas that I think is not dark enough. Okay, and you can brush off any extra ink on your scratch paper or your paper towel and then go back in and wiggle. Okay, and then pick up a little bit more. We're almost finished. I'm going to add a little bit right between here. And I'm just kind of hitting these little areas right now because we're actually almost done. I'm just getting these little areas here. And then go back. And again, this is where you can go back, and if you feel like any little areas are not quite dark enough or you want a little more contrast, just go back and add some ink and just kind of wiggle so you blur the edges. You don't want any solid lines here, start and stop lines. You want to have it nice and smooth. You don't want any sharp edges between your colors. And then I think we're almost done. Okay, so let me finish a couple of these little sections here, and then we're going to clean it up a little bit, and I'll show you how we do that. So if you're watercoloring your roses and you're not quite happy with how they're turning out, just stay with it, because odds are if you just keep going, it's going to work out. So I'm going to give this a little squeeze to get that water flowing, and then we're just going to lightly go over some of these raised edges here, just so it's not too white. So I'm just kind of going across the raised edges. I'm also kind of blending any little harsh edges that might be visible. Okay, so there's my blue rose. I'm going to close up this ink pad, and actually, you know what, I need to add just a little bit more. I can see right here. So I'm just going to come back in here. Okay. A little bit of color on those raised edges. We don't want it too white, and we want to see a little contrast from the background too. Okay, there we go. So I just kind of hit those raised edges a little bit, just so it's not too white, and then I'll show you how we're going to clean this up. Okay, so we'll close this up. We're going to use a little piece of sandpaper, and I'm just going to lightly hit the raised edges to bring back the white for the raised edge, so there's a little more contrast between the petals. And this, I've folded it once and twice, so I've made almost like a little bit of a block, just so I have a flat surface. And you're just going to lightly sand, and you're just going to go back and forth. Now the other thing I want to tell you is, let's say that you used a lot of water on here, and your paper will take a lot of water because it's watercolor paper, but you might lose some of the raised edges. So don't worry about it, just keep going. And you can actually put this back in your embossing folder. It's easy to line it back up and run it through your Big Shot again. You'll get those raised edges. So there's lots of little fixes, and it's a really fun technique. So again, I'm just lightly hitting those raised edges. And let me wipe off all this little sanding stuff. And you can see we have a pretty blue rose, and we'll watercolor this a different color. I'll show you another one that I've done. This one is using Pretty in Pink ink and Rich Razzleberry. And back to the sample. I actually don't remember the colors I used on this one because I did it, gosh, maybe about a year or so ago. I'm kind of thinking this is Calypso Coral, and this is So Saffron with a little bit of Calypso Coral mixed in, but I'm not positive. But just know it's a yellow and an orangey peachy kind of color. The watercolor paper is layered on a little bit of basic black cardstock, and that's layered onto Certainly Celery. So I hope you enjoyed this technique and you will give watercoloring a try. You can visit my blog at KeenanCreations.com for more ideas. Thank you.